When making games, there are broadly two major audiences that developers have to choose between appealing to, and those are the multiplayer or single player audiences. In this instance, PvP versus PvE. Few games get to do both in equal measure. In fact, I'm really struggling to think of many examples right now off the top of my head. But which one is the right audience, and which one should Dawn of War 4 prioritize? Dawn of War is one of those weird games where the series is incredibly disjointed. Normally in a series, you'd expect that each game is like an iteration of the last. But for anyone who's played more than one Dawn of War game, you know that that is just not true. Dawn of War 1, 2, and 3 could not be more different. And now that we have the fourth one on the way, the question is really, what's its approach going to be? Who is it going to prioritize? Dawn of War 1 was very much more of a classic RTS in the style. It stripped things down a bit. It's not as crazy about base building as something like Age of Empires, but it definitely scratches a lot of those sort of civilization building itches that people tend to have with RTS games. This made it so that when they released Dawn of War 2, there was definitely a lot of friction. All of the base building was gone and it was reduced down to the bare bones, a much more tactical experience. Something that I never explained in my original video about being worried about Dawn of War 4 was that I was approaching it from the perspective of a Dawn of War 2 player, specifically an Elite Mod player, which is basically PvP only. It's not a PvE mod, it's not something that expands the campaign. Yet, a majority of the comments that I got on the video were from people who were very much Dawn of War 1 and specifically PvE fans. People who were interested in the campaign, people who were interested in single player skirmish battles. And they're not wrong. In fact, if anything, it just showed to me that broadly, the audience for Dawn of War in the past has been single player players, for want of a better word. Dawn of War 1 has been kept alive primarily through a lot of its PvE mods, like something like Apocalypse mod. And the stats don't lie. When we look at the player counts of the Dawn of War series, we'll notice clearly in descending order that Dawn of War 1 is the most popular, followed by Dawn of War 2, and then Dawn of War 3. What does this tell us about the Dawn of War fanbase? Well, it tells us broadly that they generally prefer the older games, but there is a big difference in particular between Dawn of War 1 and 2. Why is that? I think we have to understand the wider RTS picture. There have been plenty of RTS games in the past, some of which have prioritized single player, some have prioritized multiplayer, and there have been plenty of examples of successful multiplayer games. I mean, StarCraft became an absolute phenomenon, especially in places like Korea, where it utterly dominated competitive scenes and was incredibly successful for doing so. Relic's Company of Heroes series has had its ups and downs, but has broadly been a pretty popular, mostly PvP experience. There are people who enjoy those games for the PvE experience and people who develop very expansive single-player mods, but broadly, people play Company of Heroes because they enjoy the tactical 1v1 or team-based gameplay that it has to offer. Another great example is Age of Empires 2, which even to this day has a thriving multiplayer community with a very, very diverse roster of different factions and strategies and an evolving meta for a game that is 30 years old at this point. But in many regards, these are the outliers, and a lot of them also have cross-appeal with the single-player audiences. For example, whilst many people will be playing Age of Empires 2 in the PvP setting, a lot of people just like it because it's a very, very solid RTS. They'll happily create custom scenarios, play random map by themselves against the AI, just because there's a love for the game and what it represents. One of the things that has held back multiplayer, and specifically PvP games in the past, is whilst there is a large audience you can tap into, it is usually a very, very loyal audience, which means new games often have trouble establishing a foothold. This goes way beyond the RTS genre, for example. I mean, look at something like Escape from Tarkov. That has a huge audience, but that doesn't mean that every single extraction shooter out there also has a huge audience. We just have to look at something like Marathon from Bungie. Marathon is a game that is actually quite well regarded by the people who do enjoy it, but that player base is incredibly small. And there are all sorts of questions swirling about how long Marathon can last because it is directly trying to appeal to that Tarkov audience who are stubbornly refusing to move from the game that they do like to one which they're not sure they will like. Single-player PvE experiences, on the other hand, are usually far less tribal. Oftentimes you won't be expected to spend nearly as much time in a single-player game because you'll have your fill of the story or your fill of the content and move on. A campaign is only going to be so long, and whilst you may have replayed various campaigns multiple times, it doesn't take thousands and thousands of hours to master these things. This is the problem for Dawn of War 4 if it decides to go heavily down the PvP focus route. You have to be engaging players for thousands of hours, and you have to be engaging a lot of them. And let's be honest, the audience is not really there anymore. We've seen a massive fall off in the RTS genre in the last 20 years or so. People have moved on. It's not because RTS games have necessarily become bad by themselves, it's just reflective of a changing taste. Plenty of multiplayer-oriented RTS games have released in that time, and most of them have failed. Appetites have changed, and lots of the competitive audiences have moved elsewhere, leaving the ones that do remain to become often quite tight and quite small, and quite fixated on what they want. And that was a mistake that I made before, assuming that a lot of what I wanted out of the game was also what a lot of other people wanted out of the game, when in reality, my needs only reflect a tiny portion of the player base. I mean, let's look at a lot of PvE games, for example. Let's take Age of Mythology, Age of Empires 2 and 4, and the Total War games. These games boast numbers that are huge, and granted, all of them do have multiplayer PvP components, but aside from Age of Empires 2, you wouldn't really say that that's the main draw to them. Age of Mythology, for example, is an utterly iconic RTS, but people like it because of its range and breadth of different units and playstyles, and the fact that you can create lots of very, very interesting scenarios and recreate all sorts of what-if mythical scenarios from history and mythology. It's the same with Total War, and Total War Warhammer in particular. I don't think that game really has a thriving PvP scene, because it's not really what it's made for. You do get plenty of people who enjoy that kind of PvP, but let's be honest, most people playing Total War are doing it for the large, expansive campaigns they can have. In these instances, it's often PvP multiplayer that exists as a sort of side add-on that's a nice to have for most people. And in many regards, a lot of successful games have managed to generate these quite loyal PvP fan bases when they were never built for it. I'm a massive fan of the Dark Souls series and a lot of the FromSoft games around it, and for a long time, I used to really enjoy playing Dark Souls PvP. That is not a game that is built for PvP. It is woefully unbalanced, very irritating, and clearly not a priority for the developers. But it offered something that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. There was a certain community around it. There were certain very interesting strategies, there were ways to build your character, and it was all done in an environment that you just couldn't get in any other game. So, despite the fact that Dark Souls PvP was incredibly flawed, it was still incredibly fun. As much as it pains me to say, this is what makes me believe Dawn of War 4 should probably not be listening too closely to the multiplayer community, and it instead needs to focus on getting its single player experience right. Because if it can get the bones of the game right, a multiplayer community can thrive around it. If Dawn of War 4 doesn't have a loyal audience of engaged PvE players who have campaigns to play through or enjoy replaying lots of single-player skirmishes, then it's not going to generate the interest and, importantly, the recurring money that it needs to develop a solid multiplayer experience for those people who stick by. There are plenty of reasons that you would want to foster a multiplayer community. I mean, this is 2026. We do know that microtransactions exist and they work, and one of the best audiences you can target for recurring revenue in microtransactions are multiplayer communities. I'm not saying that I want that, by the way, don't shoot me. I'm just saying that it works and it's effective, you know? I've also made the argument about Dawn of War 4 that I think it is a mistake for the game to not have replay support. And I recognise that for King Art Games, it might not be as simple as just flicking a switch or spending a couple of weeks developing a replay system, and that their engine may be trickier than that. But I think it's something that would be good for the health of both the single player and multiplayer communities, because a lot of people will find the game through people casting replays on YouTube and Twitch, etc. Those people can then pick up the game, and even if they never play multiplayer, they still may be very interested in doing some skirmish battles or playing through the campaigns, buying some new ones as they come out, and generally just sticking by the community. The big kicker here is obviously the roadmap, which King Art Games released a little while ago when the game was announced. And there does seem to be a fairly clear focus for them. Whilst there are several map packs coming out post-release, it's very obvious that King Art wants to focus on campaign expansions. You have the Bloodraven story prologue, you have the Aftermath campaign expansion, and you also have various characters coming to the Last Stand mode. But content aside, Dawn of War 4 just needs to provide a good environment for PvE players. It needs to be a fun game that people want to come back to. You know, Dawn of War 1 is a great game, but it's also a game that launched with 4 factions and only got more over time. Did that stop it from becoming such a beloved game? No. In fact, it is indisputably the most popular in the series, still to this day. Recently, we had the definitive edition of Dawn of War release, combining all of the games into one, updating the engine, and that has gone down incredibly well. It has a much larger player base than all of the other Dawn of War games combined. But even on the old versions, the original vanilla Soulstorm, you still have more people playing Soulstorm than Dawn of War 2, which kinda tells you a lot about where the community is at. Dawn of War 4 needs to capture these people. It needs to convince them that 20 years later, it is worth making the jump to the new game, which was something that Dawn of War 2 couldn't do, something that Dawn of War 3 couldn't do, and something that Dawn of War 4 must do if it wants to survive. There are many questions around King Art Games' ability to create this kind of environment, and there are all sorts of things to be said about their experience with Iron Harvest, but realistically, who else could do it? Relic? Well, we've seen what happens when Relic make follow-up games in the Dawn of War series. Dawn of War 3 was for them an unmitigated disaster. There are people out there who really love Dawn of War 3, but it's very clear that their vision for the series was not the one that was going to stick with the majority of fans, and their priority of putting a PvP community first just didn't work. They failed to break into the MOBA audience that they were looking for, and the game thus failed. Had people switched to Dawn of War 3 in their droves, then we would still probably be playing that to this day. But the fact is, the experiment didn't work, and Dawn of War 4 should look to satisfy its single player and co-op community before the PvP audience. That does pain me a little bit as a Dawn of War 2 enjoyer, but let's be real. If the game is good, we're all going to play it anyway. You know, ultimately, at the end of the day, I want the game to succeed, I want the game to be fun, and ideally, King Art Games can make a game that satisfies both a single player and multiplayer audience, but if they get just the single player right, it means that the series still has legs. So I'm hoping that Dawn of War 4 puts its single player audience at the forefront of its priorities, and every now and then throws the PvP community a few bones, because I would love a replay viewer. Please. I really want to be able to make content on this game. Remember, not everything's going to be perfect about Dawn of War 4. I have my reservations myself. A lot of people have different reservations, but I think we all want the game to be a success. Unless you're just like a career hater, at which point there's really just no saving you and I don't know why you're watching this video.